Boris Johnson says the government is working together and that he will not be resigning after criticism of his intervention on Brexit. The Foreign Secretary has been accused of undermining Theresa May with a 4,000-word article setting out his own post-EU vision. But he told journalists the government was a nest of singing birds. Mr. Clarke said that in normal circumstances Mr. Johnson would have been sacked. Some reports have claimed Mr. Johnson will resign if his blueprint for Brexit is not followed. But speaking in New York, the Foreign Secretary said of course not when asked whether he was going to quit, and predicted the government would deliver a fantastic Brexit. Asked whether there was a cabinet split on Europe, Mr. Johnson said, "No, we are a government working together." "We are a nest of singing birds." Mr. Johnson and Mrs. May are both attending the United Nations General Assembly in New York. He has said his article, published in Saturday's Telegraph, was sketching out the exciting landscape of the destination ahead on Brexit. The continuing fallout from the article led, on Monday, to Mrs. May having to rebut claims that Mr. Johnson was trying to become a backseat driver in her cabinet. The Prime Minister, who is due to set out her vision for Brexit in a speech in Florence on Friday, declared, "This government is driven from the front." Speaking on BBC Radio 4's Today programme, Mr. Clarke said that in her speech Mrs. May had to set out for the first time really what the UK can realistically achieve in negotiations. That must include free access to the European market and no new barriers for our trade, he argued, and how best to avoid economic damage to the country. Alongside that, personal publicity and campaigning by the Foreign Secretary is actually just an irrelevant nuisance. Mr. Clarke said, "Sounding off personally in this way is totally unhelpful and he shouldn't exploit the fact she hasn't got a majority in Parliament." He knows perfectly well that normally the Foreign Secretary would be sacked for doing that, and she, unfortunately, after the general election, is not in the position easily to sack him, which he should stop exploiting. He also attacked Mr. Johnson for repeating one of the more simplistic and dishonest arguments of the hardline leavers in his article, a reference to taking back control of £350 million a week after Brexit. They use money because it appeals to the public, who don't, I think, follow very closely the details, he told Today. You tell people we are giving money to foreigners, and quite a lot of the public are against it. He said that if there are genuine disagreements in cabinet over Brexit, then it was in the national interest to compromise and abide by collective responsibility. Mr. Johnson used his Telegraph article to insist that Britain should pay nothing to access the EU's single market, amid reports Mrs. May will use her Florence speech to say the UK will carry on paying for access during a 3-year transition period after Brexit. The Foreign Secretary who made much of the savings the UK would make when it left the EU during last year's referendum campaign, said on Monday that his article was meant to be an opening drumroll for the PM's speech. "Because I was involved in that Brexit campaign, people want to know where we are going," he added. Mrs. May attempted to avoid a public row with her foreign secretary, telling reporters traveling with her on a trade mission to Canada, "Boris is Boris." The Prime Minister and Mr. Johnson are due at the United Nations in New York on Tuesday, where the PM will hold a series of meetings with fellow leaders, including US President Donald Trump. There will be talks on fighting online extremism and on modern slavery. A no formal meeting is planned between Mrs. May and Mr. Johnson. Former Foreign Secretary Lord.He, writing in the Daily Telegraph, warned that disunity over Brexit could hand power to Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party. Lord.He wrote, "It is putting it a bit too politely to say, in the wake of Boris Johnson's article in this newspaper on Saturday, that the approach of senior ministers to the Brexit negotiations appears to lack coordination." More bluntly, it is now 15 months since the referendum, and high time that all members of the government were able to express themselves on this subject in the same way as each other, putting forward the same points as part of an agreed plan. Hopefully, that happy circumstance will follow the speech the Prime Minister is due to give on the subject in Florence on Friday. If not, there will be no point Conservatives discussing who is going to be the Foreign Secretary, Chancellor or Prime Minister in the coming years, because Jeremy Corbyn will be Prime Minister, sitting in number 10 with John McDonnell and Diane Abbott, completely ruining this